Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Textile Talk podcast. I'm Gail Cowley and I'll be your host today. Joining me for this episode is textile artist Hannah Lamb. Just to give you a little bit of background before we start our chat. Fascinated by textiles and the stories they can tell, Hannah's practice is a personal dialogue with materials. From her studio in Bingley, West Yorkshire, she experiments with layers of imagery and surface. Print, stitch and deconstruction techniques are carefully combined to create both sculptural installation works and smaller, more intimate pieces. She's particularly well known for her use of cyanotype printing to create shadow-like prints on textiles. Hannah's interested archives, collections and the history of textile manufacturing in the north of England has led to a number of collaborations and commissions, including Lasting Impressions, 2016 and 2017 with Claire Wellesley Smith at Salts Mill, Fragments of a Dress commissioned by the Bronte Parsonage Museum, and A Cloth for the Lost Mills in 2024 for 509 Arts with Hannah Robson. Hannah has a love of historical buildings and interesting industrial spaces and enjoys situating her work in non-gallery settings. Hannah exhibits widely and is an exhibiting member of the 62 Group of Textile Artists. Alongside her work as an exhibiting artist, Hannah is a lecturer and author. She teaches the foundation degree and BA Textiles practice programmes at Bradford School of Art, Bradford College. She has also delivered talks, workshops and masterclasses for Gawthorpe Hall, Fibre Arts Australia, Harewood House, Hope and Elvis, De Montfort University, the Textile Study Group and the 62 Group. Her first solo book, Poetic Cloth, Creating Meaning in Textile Art, was published by Batsford in 2019. And her second book, Unfolding Cloth, Inspiration from Historical Textiles, is released the 11th of September 2025. Before we dive into the conversation, a quick thank you to the School of Stitch Textiles for supporting this podcast. They are the UK's leading provider of City and Guilds accredited home study courses in textiles. From beginners through to advanced master practitioner programmes, you can study flexibly from home with expert tutor support. Visit sofst.org to find out more. That's sofst.org. So hi Hannah, and thank you so much for joining me for this podcast episode of Textile Talk today. It's really nice to be able to speak with you.
Great to meet you as well, Gail. Yeah, lovely to chat.
So I wonder if I could start off by just asking you about your educational background, really. I know that you studied embroidery at BA level and textiles at MA level. Could you walk us through what initially drew you into textile art and how your education shaped your practice and really your identity as an artist?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I grew up around textiles. I grew up in a family where people made things. My mum made my clothes, and my grandma as well. She would make things, so there were jumpers knitted and all sorts of outfits. And so I was used to that kind of creative process of making something from a pattern, I suppose, often, and being around materials, being around threads, and there were always things around in the family home. So yeah, that was sort of, I suppose, just a natural thing to be around. But in terms of education, I was really lucky. Secondary school, I went to a school that had a very interdisciplinary approach to art and design, and it wasn't till later that I realised that not everybody had those opportunities. So we had teachers who were jewellers, and so we'd do sculpture with wire, and we had a technician who was a ceramicist, a really fantastic ceramicist. And, you know, we had people from the textile background, and we had somebody else who was a watercolour painter. So I was able to we were all able to work across lots of different processes and kind of got this really multidisciplinary kind of approach to art and design. And then after sort of GCSE and A levels at school, I went on to do a foundation year at the local college, which is not so common now, but was really the route that everybody took at that time. And that sort of 1 year college course, which was quite diagnostic, where everybody would try lots of different processes and work out through that year what their kind of discipline was going to be. That was very interesting. And although I already knew that textiles was kind of where I was heading, there was a point at which I was encouraged to go into the textile department, and I refused to. I decided I wanted to be in the art department because it felt like a better fit. And the fine art area, although there were painters there and there were sculptors, I felt like I fitted in better there. And I suppose that was quite a bold thing to do, but I was quite a bolshy kind of teenager. And so
Surely not.
well, I was, and I sort of dug my heels in and went, no, I'm going to stay in the art department. And then I found the embroidery degree program at Manchester, which sort of really aligned particularly well with what I wanted to do, because it had more of a focus on kind of fine art and sort of linked that textile as art practice kind of really well. So that worked brilliantly. And I think I've kind of maybe continued to sort of sit in that area that's kind of textile, but it doesn't feel comfortable with the commercial side of textile design as such, and feels happier in that kind of art practice. So that's continued to kind of shape who I am and where I kind of situate my practice.
And you obviously decided that you wanted to go on and do an MA as well. Was that just because you loved what you were doing, or you felt you needed to learn more? How did that come about?
So that really came about as a result of feeling the need for perhaps a slight change of direction, or a kind of bit of focus. And by that point, so I didn't do my master's straight after I did my degree. I did my degree, and then I think I was actually encouraged to go and do a master's afterwards. And I felt like I'd just been in education for such a long time. I actually needed to go and explore what the world had to offer. And I think that was probably the right choice, although, yeah, who knows what might have happened otherwise. But yeah, so I went off and did my own practice for a while, and then I got a placement through the Crafts Council for a couple of years, and then I ended up getting a teaching job at Bradford, where I still teach. And it was actually while I was there, so doing part-time teaching, that I kind of felt a little bit like I lost my way, perhaps, with my practice, and just needed a bit of focus. So the masters came as a way of, not necessarily specifically that I needed more techniques, but more that I needed to find out what it was that my practice was about. And so that helped me to do that, and perhaps to just kind of take things to a higher level. Yeah, that was why I did that.
And what did you specialise in your masters?
So my master's is in textiles, but again, kind of sitting it in the kind of fine art realm. And what I suppose, after I graduated, I'd been very fine art sort of textiles up till that point, and then kind of going out into the big wide world, you suddenly realise, oh heck, I need to make some money. And
yeah, unfortunate, isn't it?
And the reality kicks in a little bit, and trying to work out quite how I was going to do that. And I ended up, through kind of various things that I did, I was still doing kind of art pieces, but I ended up doing sort of small batch production and kind of more craft designer maker kind of products, I suppose, and still all one off, which is, of course, really hard way to go about doing business. But anyway, yeah, so I'd kind of done that, and things had perhaps become quite in some ways, not really, but a little bit more commercial. And so trying to find something that felt very true to me, I think I felt like I'd lost my way with that a little bit. And so the masters was kind of more down that road. Yeah, and sort of starting to experiment with imagery and kind of printing and dyeing, which actually wasn't part of my degree. So I suppose I did as a part of that, not necessarily through the taught content of the masters, but actually through my own research, starting to experiment with that kind of printed imagery.
It sounds as though, just going back, I know you were saying that you were always around mum and grandma, sort of doing things, doing craft things when you were small. It sounds as though that you had a lot of creative play or creativity around you. I know that you say you collected buttons and saved yogurt pots. How do you think that early environment shaped your curiosity with materials and processes?
Yeah, I think kind of those formative years are really important, and being able to play and experiment with materials, and learning to use scissors and your manual dexterity, that's really important kind of part of growing up. And I think, yeah, that sort of tactile quality of handling materials. I mean, we do things like probably not necessarily every week, but on quite a regular basis, we'd go to the fabric shops and we'd pick out, or the market in the nearby town, and we'd look for fabrics and we'd pick fabrics out for the latest item that was being made. And so you do get to understand about materials, what they're made of, what they feel like, how they drape. So those are really important things, I think, that have fed into my practice and continued to. Yeah, but that kind of, yeah, that creative play, I think, of having things around you, I think is really important. And we always had in the kitchen, there was always a pot of paintbrushes and there was always a jam jar of PVA glue. And I just thought that was normal. And and I'm really glad that I grew up in that sort of setting where there were always things around to make things. And I think if the resources are there, then you're more inclined to try things and experiment and to kind of make stuff. And yeah, I think access to resources is hugely important. And maybe there's slightly, I'm quite an untidy person. Having things around me is a really important part of who I am as a creative person, because your eye falls on something and you go, oh yeah, that might do something. That might be the thing that I need to do
Yeah.
that thing. I'm not
Yes.
being very clear, but I mean, it's just access to stuff, I
Yes.
think, is hugely important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also, as you're saying, if it was left out and it was there for you to use, as and when you felt like it, I think that's quite important because
Yeah.
if you, which I'm the opposite, I'm quite a tidy person.
Oh, I,
So I feel, I feel the need to tidy everything away. And I think once it's gone and it's behind cupboard doors or whatever, it doesn't catch your eye in the same way, and there isn't
Mhm.
quite the same invitation to use it at that moment.
That's a great word, actually, invitation. Yeah, yeah, I absolutely get that. Yeah, I'm the opposite. Yes, I mean, actually, if I put things away, I forget about them completely.
Mm.
Um, so to the extent that you could have a half open packet of biscuits that goes in a biscuit tin, and I'll forget that there are any biscuits. I'm really that sort of forgetful when things go away. So yeah, to be able to see things, I like things in clear containers, or I like things out, but that does get to a point where it can get quite
Yeah.
chaotic.
Well, I mean, I do put things away, but I also have to say that I've put things away on lots of occasions, forgotten I've got them completely, and then bought another one.
Oh, I know, that's classic, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
The one thing I've never forgotten, funnily enough, is where the biscuits were and if there was any left. I've got a laser focus on that. So after your BA, I know that you experimented with different products like jewellery and bags, but then obviously you moved in a new direction after your MA. What do you think the turning point was that sort of helped you focus less on what would sell and more about what mattered to you?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, that. I suppose The big kind of change to some extent was, I suppose, having a teaching role, and I suppose that changed the emphasis for me that perhaps I didn't need to make an income, financial income, from my practice in the same way, and so it released me to do what I wanted to do with it. So that sounds like a very cool kind of answer, I suppose. If
Yeah.
you haven't got so many people, I'm going to say something that's maybe a bit controversial, but so many people perhaps have another family member or a partner who has a substantial income that means that perhaps they're able to please themselves. But if you haven't got that, you kind of,
Mm.
you haven't necessarily got the resources. You've got to pay the rent. And so, yeah, when having a teaching role meant that I had a stable income and meant that I could therefore, alongside that, please myself, really. Yeah.
I think it's actually, I thought it was a great answer. I think it's something that we probably don't think about enough from the point of view of what motivates people. And textiles isn't known for, well, no, I don't think any art discipline is known for making big bucks from.
Mhm.
So there's always going to be an element of, you've got to keep the wolf from the door and you've got to keep bills paid. But if you can also do something that you love alongside that, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate that I've been able to kind of combine those two things, and I see them as being really, the teaching and the art practice. I see them as being sort of mutually important to each other. They go hand in hand, and I've always felt that. And what I do in my teaching kind of feeds into my own practice, and my own practice feeds into my teaching all of the time. I think the teaching role can sometimes take over a bit, but there are payoffs. There's always payoffs with things, and I really enjoy both. I think I would be slightly perhaps lost doing one or the other, but having both alongside each other has always been great.
As you say, one feeds into the other because when you're directing students, then obviously they will be interested in your work and that will feed into theirs. And vice versa. Sometimes you'll see somebody doing something and think, oh, that's a great idea. Or what about trying that and converting it into something in my own practice?
Yeah, I think, although sometimes it's almost as much kind of, I'm dishing out advice to somebody, and then I think, oh gosh, Hannah, you really need to listen to your own advice sometimes, about whether it's about taking risks or being brave with things, or kind of, it might even be something like simplifying things, those kind of general themes. So, not necessarily so much of a process necessarily, but more kind of that critical thinking that's so important in, higher education, kind of art practice, art school thinking.
Mm.
All of that kind of stuff, I think, is enriched by teaching and kind of thinking about the creative process.
Are you able to use any of the facilities that work for your own work?
I am, yeah. I'm really lucky that I get to go and, well, I have to go and find the time to do it outside of my teaching role. But yeah, I can go and tinker around and play from time to time. So it's very handy, particularly, as I said, I'm quite cluttered kind of person. It's quite nice to go and have a big empty space to go and do something in. So when, perhaps on an evening or in the holidays, I might go and use the print room or, big pattern cutting table. And those are great opportunities. And I've also had some great opportunities to collaborate with my students as well. So there have been projects I've done where I've actually kind of invited my students to come and take part and to get involved in things.
And how does that work out?
Yeah, really well. It's been lovely, actually. So yeah, there's been a couple of occasions where I've needed to do something that really will take a lot of, I was going to say man hours. That's not. I don't like that phrase. What would be a better phrase?
A lot
Woman
of time.
hours.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just needed, a lot of hands to do things. And so I'll say, I've got this project I'm working on, and I can't, I've not been able to pay people for it. And I'm always really upfront about that, But, if you'd like to come and get involved, I'd really value that. And, it'd be an interesting opportunity for you to find out about the process and whatever. And it's been great. I've always had lovely support from my students when I've been doing those kind of things, where people, if they've been able to, if they've got the time, will come and help out. And they seem to get an awful lot from it, and I get a lot from it. And yeah, so it's mutually beneficial again, like the conversations that come out of it. And perhaps it's a different kind of setting for them to kind of pick my brains as well. It's sort of, everybody gets something out of it, I think. So we've done some things where one of the projects I did was called Fragment of a Dress, and that was a project that I did for the Bronte Parsonage Museum. And as part of that, we had some stories that people had given us, like little kind of passages of text, and I wanted to stitch those onto a great big silk skirt. And so I invited students to come and help me with that. And so we were stitching all this lettering. And that was just such a lovely process to sit and stitch together, and something that we don't often get to do in college, because often the pace that we're doing things at is actually quite quick, or we only have a little short lesson. So to be able to spend quite an expansive amount of time together chatting and stitching, and it was a really rich experience.
Yeah, I'm sure it's wonderful for them to be able to get that level of experience, maybe even having a look at how their life maybe, or their career might take off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so lots of interesting experiences out of that kind of process. And it's funny, because somebody said to me sort of at the end, when we were finishing up the last few, they was like, oh, I could take one of these away with me to finish off. We were trying to get the last ones done. And somebody said, did you ever think about sending them out to people? I was like, no, it just never crossed my mind. I mean, I might be a bit dim here, but it probably would have been a more efficient process to just send these kind of squares of silk out to people and get them stitched by different people. But there was something so special about sitting together in one space, and I had different people come on different days, but it was lovely kind of continuum. And yeah, just a wonderful experience to sit and stitch together.
What course is it that your students are doing? Or are
Yeah,
they different?
yeah, I teach I actually I'm the programme leader for the foundation degree in textile practice and the BA top-up. So they're level 5 and level 6 qualifications, but they're part-time. So the students come from all over to do the course. So tends to attract mature students because of the flexibility of the course. And yeah, we get a great bunch of students, and they're very open to different opportunities, which is great.
Yeah. And I suppose they must be very committed if they've come back part-time, and they are obviously mature, so they're not having to be there. It's not as though they've got to attend, schools. And
Yeah, they've made a choice.
in the history, isn't it? Yeah. So
Yeah.
they obviously want to be there, and that's always a very pleasant way of meeting people.
It is. Yeah, definitely.
So I mean, I know that obviously we've talked about your work, but we haven't talked so much about the techniques, and I know that people that listen to this will be really interested in that. So I wonder if you could just describe to us, because you do really use a quite a rich mixture of techniques. You've got stitch, print, wax, found objects. Could you just talk us through a couple of your favourites, and why they are your favourites, really?
Yeah, I mean, I've never been. I'm always slightly in awe, actually, of the people who have their one process and they really refine it and perfect it and become sort of master craftsmen. And yeah, I'd love to be that kind of artist, but I'm not. And you have to just accept who you are sometimes, don't you?
Yeah.
I do love all sorts of different materials and all sorts of different processes. I guess I always come back to stitch ultimately, although I I love print, and I have, a real kind of passion for kind of cyanotype, which is one of the things. But I always come back to stitch actually in the end. And I think that comes back to the degree I did in embroidery, which sort of is fundamental to my thought process. I'm an embroiderer, even when I kind of create pieces that don't have any stitch on them at all. But so I work a lot with hand stitch, and that tends to be very simple hand stitch, a lot of running stitch. Yeah, and I enjoy that as a way of kind of consolidating layers and kind of putting together, collaging almost different fabrics. So that's a really nice process that I enjoy. I feel, a lot of people will recognise the kind of meditative qualities of hand stitch. So when I do get a chance to do that, I love that. And I've got a piece that's on show at the moment down at the Craft Study Centre, which has got a lot of hand stitch, which was lovely to do. I was making that through the winter, and I loved sitting quietly, kind of adding the layers of stitch to that. I also like to work with a process called Devore. Devore is a print process, and it's, in some ways, it's not a great process. It's probably not great for the environment, but it's a print process that kind of degrades fabrics. It breaks down cellulose fibres, and it's very interesting for, again, kind of revealing layers. So you kind of typically see Devore, a kind of archetypal example is something like a velvet scarf that has a kind of pile pattern. So people might recognise where, you might have a fabric that has some of the material is kind of taken away on the surface, and that's a Devore process. And I like kind of subverting that and doing that on sort of 100% cellulose fibres like cotton or linen or viscose, but combining that with stitch, so you can create very interesting kind of worn looking kind of materials or aged looking materials. So that's an interesting one. And then the other thing that I suppose people really recognise me a lot for using cyanotype, which is photographic process, and that's the blue that you see coming through in a lot of my work is all cyanotype.
And how does that work?
Yeah, so it's actually quite simple photographic process. So it's really old. It dates back to the mid-19th century, and it's one of the early photographic processes, and was then superseded by, probably better photographic processes for making photographic images. But as a craft process, it's really interesting. So it uses a couple of chemicals that are mixed up to create a light sensitive solution, and then you apply that light sensitive solution to your paper or your fabric, and it means that then when you expose that to daylight or any kind of UV light, it reacts and becomes a fast image, if you like. So then if you put something between the coated surface, like a stencil or an image or an object, if you put something on the surface and then put it out in daylight, and then you wash away the unexposed chemicals, it creates an image where the object or the image was. You get a permanent sort of shadow, if you like. And I think that's what I was drawn to originally with that process, was this kind of permanent shadow. And when I first started doing it, I used to do a lot outside, and not so much now, but I love the immediacy of it, of printing with the sun. I just thought it's magical. It's just a magical quality to it.
How long does it take to actually develop the image?
Well, in photographic terms, it's quite slow, but I don't really think of it as being terribly slow, but it depends how bright the sun is, actually. So at the moment, I'm just looking out, it's quite grey where I am at the minute. It would probably take maybe 10 to 15 minutes. But on a really sunny day, it might only take 5 minutes. So it's fairly quick, really.
Yeah, and then do you have to set the image with something, or is that it then?
You don't need to set it, but you do wash away the chemicals that haven't been exposed. So what's happening is that the UV light is exposing the image. So the areas around your stencil, say you've put a leaf on a piece of fabric, it will expose the area around the leaf. And if you then wash away the chemicals that were underneath where the leaf were, that bit will be white and the bit around it will be blue. So you get a sort of reverse image, if you like, or not reverse. What do I mean?
Yes, I know what you mean. Oh dear.
Negative. A
Negative, that's the
negative
word.
image. That's what I was trying to say.
So I know that you obviously, and I presume this is probably your university background, but you always start with research, which is the way you should start. I know it's the way we tell all our students to start. So visiting archives or museums or whatever, or even just visiting a place perhaps before you create anything. So I wonder if you could sort of describe for us how a project typically evolves from inspiration to finished piece, and how you choose the materials and processes that you'll use for it.
I think one thing to say is that there's no real typical project, there's no real typical process. And I think it's probably important to say that, because I think sometimes people would get the impression that there is a right or a wrong way to go about doing a creative project. And I think in reality, things take their own course. You have to be open to, I suppose, those little flashes of inspiration, the kind of happenstance. I think those are things that are important. And I think, you'll know this, when you're teaching, you often are teaching some formulas that help people. And I think, I'm aware that sometimes people will think, oh, I haven't done it. I've done it in the wrong order. And I always, I always say
Yeah,
to
yeah,
people,
I've heard
it's like
people say that a lot.
yeah, there's that whole thing of, you shouldn't come up with the idea before you've done the research. And I will often kind of pick up my students on this. I think what's important is, from my point of view, yes, I do a lot of research, and I love to kind of go on a bit of a deep dive by reading about stuff, by looking stuff up online, by visiting places. I think those are all really enriching, and I do all of those things. But I think also is to just be open to ideas. And what I've kind of found over the years is that you kind of need to allow a bit of space and allow a bit of time. And if ideas come, fine, great, write them down, draw them, sketch them. And I do that. I have a little notebook, and I won't call it a sketchbook. It's more of a little scribbly kind of notebook. But when I have ideas, I jot them down in whatever format, often a little sketch actually. And it's not intended for anybody else. It's just for my own kind of thoughts. It's kind of keep a hold of all of those things, but sit lightly with them. And I think the thing that I pick my students up on, and I try really hard not to do, I don't really actually, in my own practice, is to avoid coming up with a fully formed idea right at the start and then just try and justify it.
Yeah,
I think you're not being true to yourself if you do that, and you're not allowing the best project to emerge. So I think for me, the project can go in all different directions. You might come up with some great ideas right at the start and then do some research that kind of helps that formulate. But it's often about kind of, okay, I've got that idea, great, but let's come up with another 10 or 20 ideas, and you can think that something's the most amazing idea and you're totally in love with it. But actually then when you make yourself come up with more ideas, or you kind of do some further research, you kind of oh, actually, if that was the first thing that I'd thought of, it'd be the first thing that 10 other people would have thought of as well. It's allowing yourself the space to come up with more options, I think is often important.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I I would agree with you there, because I often feel like a bit of a, not a fraud exactly, but actually saying to students, you need to go away and research, you need to come back with ideas, and you need to give your tutor a good idea of what it is you're doing, because otherwise then they can't comment effectively on whether it's going to fulfill a criteria, if it's a particular program or whatever. But And I'm always very dubious about saying, but of course, during that process, you will have other ideas, or you should
Mm,
have other ideas.
yeah,
Because sometimes when people are only just beginning their textile journey,
yeah,
they need so much direction. And I think sometimes they're quite tempted when you say, well, you could just, what they take from that is, rather than, well, I'm going to go away and I'm going to come back with a lot more ideas, they just think, well, I'll wing it, which sometimes does not produce the best end result, does
but
it?
a bit of winging it is okay. I might come to regret saying this in the future. It'll come back to bite me. But I do think I I sort of feel, and this is partly just how I work, and everybody works differently, and there's no right or wrong way of working. But I do think remaining open to possibilities is really important as you develop a project. So I think, having an idea but being open to it changing as you work is so important, because otherwise you kind of steamroller ahead. I've seen this happen before where somebody has an idea and then they just go, right, that's what I'm making, and it's all designed and this is how it's happening, regardless of actually any of you've got to be open to the happenstance, the thing that maybe goes a little bit wrong, and then you go, oh, well, I didn't intend it to work like that, but actually, let's have a
Yes.
cup of tea. I'm a big one for drinking a lot of tea, but that's when you have a bit of a stand back and look at things and go, okay, that wasn't the intention, but is there actually a more interesting possibility out of this? And I think I very seldom, sometimes I will have a fully formed idea, but always things will develop as they go along. I mean, part of my process is I do a lot of sampling, and I think that's one of the things to say that's important. And I think, to test out your materials, to test out your process, to see how it's going to work. So I do all of that, but even so, and kind of embracing that, there's going to be some there's going to be some changes, or there's going to be some possibilities that come out of that. I think that's super exciting, and I think you've got to be
Embrace it. Yeah.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
embrace it. So I think, yeah, just be, it's almost like you've got to be switched on to it. You've got to be awake to it. So if you kind of don't give yourself the opportunity to notice that there are exciting things happening, or there are other possibilities, you're really just becoming a bit of a machine. So I think
Mhm.
it's sort of avoiding just becoming an art making machine and thinking, or being involved in that thinking as you're making. I think that's really important.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, something like cyanotype is going to dramatically up the element of unpredictability because you're not really sure how it's going to turn out. There's all sorts of different
Yeah,
possibilities at play. So I suppose that in itself maybe creates those opportunities to sort of take a moment and reassess and see what would be the best way forward.
I think like any process, you can actually make it a very controlled process. So people who do that as a kind of studio process, you know, people who are very technical photographers have an awful lot of control over it. But I think it's about how you choose to use that process. I'm a big fan of kind of working with brushstrokes and allowing the marks of making to kind of come through. And I like the kind of serendipity that can come through processes. So I do tend to embrace that. But yeah, some other people would work in a much more controlled fashion. It just
Yeah,
depends
yeah.
on your personality.
Yes, I think some people might potentially find it very stressful not to know how something's going to turn out, mightn't they?
Well, I would say though that with experience, that's the beauty of having done something, is that you've a certain amount of material knowledge and process knowledge that knows you have an idea what's going to happen. And so, yeah, you kind of, that experience is quite helpful at times, but also kind of freeing yourself up to make things in such a way that it, yeah, I generally embrace the serendipity and
Mhm.
kind of allow or make space for things to kind of do their own thing a lot. And and I like that in my work, but not everybody does like that.
Mm. And I mean, you are based in West Yorkshire, so you're surrounded by a very strong textile heritage. I
Yeah.
wonder if that location, do you think, and the obviously there is a big industrial past there. Do you think that it's influenced the way you choose to work, or the stories you choose to tell in your work?
Yeah, undoubtedly. I mean, one of the things that's important to say is yes, there's a huge textile past, but there's also a decent sized textile present. And so there is textile manufacturing all around this area. It's quite hidden to a lot of people, but it is around, and I've been very privileged to be able to go and see a lot of that. So through my teaching role, I've had some great opportunities to go and visit some of that textile manufacturing, and it's just amazing. It's incredible stuff. So to just see kind of the production lines, and to see, textile manufacturing is a very linear process. And in a lot of ways, like, it goes through the fibre goes through one process after another. And, we have examples around here of what's described as vertical mill, where you would have literally all of the processes in one manufacturing facility or in one company. And, that's amazing to see, from a bale of fibre all the way through to a highly finished cloth, and all of the myriad processes that go into making that. So I love to see that, but not necessarily from a technical point of view, but I just love to see what happens to the material, and the teasing and the combing, and all these
Mm.
different things that are happening. But yeah, in terms of the heritage, the heritage is incredible around here. And, we've got some brilliant museums, and we've got wonderful archive collections, and, the textile is in the place, really. So, Bradford's just teeming with textile references. And I feel like there's a real textile culture around here,
Mm.
which kind of comes through into everything. And yeah, I've been very lucky to be able to incorporate that into my practice, both in terms of the kind of the heritage, the collections. Actually, I mean, that's one of the things that I've always loved. But then also that kind of understanding of current present day kind of textile manufacturing as well. It's great to have all of those elements. But yeah, I mean, the collections, museums and what have you, that's always been a part of, that's the other thing that I grew up with, actually, is going to museums. It was a big part of my childhood. So all our summer holidays were spent going to museums, stately homes, castles. My parents were obviously determined to get their money's worth out of their National Trust membership. That was our entire kind of, felt like anyway, our summer holidays were spent going around to all those kind of things. So yeah, but which I was really lucky to do. But I think that has then kind of fed into my passion for heritage, and looking at historical costumes, and going to, I went to a lot of places like textile mills, seeing water wheels, and understanding all of that kind of side of things. But yeah, I think there's a real love in me for kind of something, it's very difficult to pin down, but something special about historical textiles
Mm.
that kind of is perhaps about storytelling. But it's also, there's a part of me that has this real romance around historical textiles, and I know it's a failing in some respects, but I do tend to have quite a romantic kind of
I,
nature.
do you know, I remember sort of when I was doing my what was a diploma, Sitting Girls diploma at the time, and I was lucky enough to do it at Gawthorpe Hall.
Oh, wonderful.
So we had access to. I mean, I don't think probably I properly appreciated at the time, but we had access to all sorts of wonderful archives there,
Yeah.
and in the Rachel K. Shuttleworth collection. I remember one day we could ask the two ladies that looked after it, could they lift out such a thing for us or such a thing for us? And I think we were doing stunt work perhaps, and they'd lifted out this fragment of Elizabeth I's dress.
Wow.
And I remember just sort of not holding it in my hands because we couldn't, obviously,
Yeah.
for obvious reasons, but certainly, with gloves on, kind of holding it and
Mhm.
just looking at this piece of fabric and thinking, that bridge across that Yeah.
huge amount of time. And just thinking about the woman that had obviously sewn it, the woman that had worn it. It's just a real link to the past, isn't it? It is. It's kind of magic, isn't it? It's it is like a portal or a bridge or like a time machine, and that survives. I think, yeah, it's the same kind of magic for me as kind of like a backstage pass, or I've been lucky
Yeah.
enough to go to a couple of kind of heritage properties where I've been able to kind of go in when it's closed to the public, or I've gone into the parts of the building that are normally closed to the public, and that to me just feels like, oh, goosebumps, It's just,
Yeah,
I don't know why. I have no idea why, but it just feels really special. It's privileged, isn't it? It's a
it
privileged
is.
access to something that not everybody gets a chance to see.
It
And
absolutely is.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just something really
Mm.
precious about it. And yeah, that possibility of telling stories through that. And I suppose sometimes directly, that might be directly the kind of the stories of who wore that thing, that item, or who used it, or who made it. It could be directly that, or it could be almost like a new story that you create with that as well. I think, objects like that are super powerful. They can hold they can hold a lot. They can take an awful lot. They can
Mm.
take, there could be 10 people in a room looking at an object and you'd all have a different story from it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
uh,
it's true.
that's just an incredible thing. So yeah, I think historical textile objects, wonderful resources in so many ways.
Mm. I mean, I know that you've worked on commissions for places like the Bronte Parsonage and collaborated with museums. So, I mean, what is the appeal for you of working with archives and communities? How do they shape the final piece when you're working on that commission?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I find it a really rewarding kind of an enriching kind of process. And I think sometimes, though, it can actually be quite overwhelming. So I remember when I was invited to make some work for the Bronte Parsonage Museum in Haworth in West Yorkshire, just up the road. It was like a dream come true kind of opportunity in a lot of ways, and so that can kind of make you feel a bit like, what am I going to make? Oh
Oh,
no,
yeah.
it's too big
Here
of an
comes creative
opportunity.
block.
Yeah, and then sort of at the time, I was kind of, things were still a little bit tricky in terms of access around post COVID kind of lockdowny kind of stuff. And so I did a lot of research online using their online catalogue. It also meant that I could kind of really look at the whole range of things they'd got. I just remember thinking, I don't know what to do. There's just so much here. I don't know where to start with this. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier about kind of sitting gently with ideas and just allowing yourself almost to sort of sift through things, just see what grabs you. And that was an opportunity where I just noticed the things that grabbed me were not the grand things. They were actually the sort of tiny little bits of stuff. The and I noticed how they were catalogued they were catalogued as fragment of a dress. And that's where
Mhm.
that project all came from, was just me noticing that name. I just thought, that's just such a wonderful phrase, fragment of a dress. And why is there that? And so then, that makes you ask questions about, why has somebody cut up Charlotte Bronte's dress?
Yeah,
And so then if you ask that question, then you think, oh, well, other people would want, why has nobody else asked about this? The questions then start to become a story. And I think my way into that project was also thinking about the need to make something that had relevance now. It's too easy to make something that is nostalgic, and I love that. I'd be very happy to wallow in something that's very nostalgic. But it has to have relevance now to a contemporary audience. It has to, if you're making something about heritage, well, it doesn't have to, but I think it makes it more powerful if you can do something that then says something about what's going on in our lives today. And if you can, therefore, you talked about bridging, and I think that's a really nice expression to think about how you bridge the gap from something that feels such a long time ago and such a different society and a different way of living, and to draw the connections with our lives today. I think, that's kind of a really interesting way of approaching things, and maybe has more relevance to a wider range of people who perhaps, some people, they wouldn't be that interested in heritage. So it's the kind of so what factor. Okay, you made a lovely thing, so what? What's it
Yeah.
to me? I think, there are always going to be audiences who will love beautiful textiles that are inspired by things from the past, but how do you kind of get people who aren't already interested in that to take notice? How do you kind of start conversations? Yeah, those are some of the things that crossed my mind.
If you had a choice, would you always work to commission, or would you prefer to do your own work, or is it just that you enjoy the change between the two?
I think it's quite nice to have a bit of both. I think commissions kind of push you sometimes to do something outside of what you would have ordinarily done. And I think they can help you to be quite brave, but they put a lot of pressure on you as well, because you feel like there's an outcome. There has to be a thing at the end of it, and it needs to meet the needs of somebody else. And that can be really useful because it can spur you on, but it can also be restrictive. So I think it's good to have a bit of both. I think just working on your own projects can be quite challenging, because kind of coming up with ideas all of the time, you can kind of get a bit lost in yourself. Maybe you can lack focus, but commission is very good for having focus, because often it has a deadline, and we love a deadline because it helps us to get
No, we
done.
don't.
Yeah, but a bit of both is probably my preference, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know that you're a member of the 62 group as well, which is sort of known for its boundary pushing in textiles. How has being part of that influenced you? Has it changed the way you approach your textiles or not?
Yeah, I think it probably has changed how I'm kind of making work and the kind of work that I'm making. I think it's, again, actually, that has helped. It has pushed me. Again, having deadlines are great because we have to do something. We've got some accountability. And one of the things about the 62 group that really keeps you on your toes is the fact that it's a 3 strikes and you're out group. So if
That
you
sounds a
work,
little harsh.
yeah, it does sound really harsh when you say it like that, but I, everybody knows that when they join, and you kind of, I think you join because you want that kind of rigor. And so basically, if your work is not selected for 3 exhibitions in a row, or if you don't submit work for 3 exhibitions in a row, you're out of the group. And I think that's actually great, because I think the textile world can be a bit cozy at times. And I think, people are very nice. And I think it's quite good to have a little bit of, it shakes things up. I mean, I've had work not
Mhm.
selected for an exhibition, and it you're grumpy about it when it happens.
Yeah.
And you think, well, I really liked that piece of work, and that was really special to me, and they didn't like it. And, it's not so much didn't like it, they didn't feel that it answered the requirements for the exhibition. But it's good because, you can sit on your laurels and you can think, oh, well, that, I don't think I ever think that will do. But I think it stops you from getting complacent, and it maybe pushes you to do the very best work that you can do. I think the other thing that's been good for me is, I think I felt encouraged to make bigger work. And I think that's partly because of some of the exhibition spaces that we've shown in, although
Mhm.
not the current exhibition actually, because that's all small work. But it has given me a chance to make some bigger pieces, and that's been exciting. Not to say that is a priority over and above the kind of the quality of work, but I think it's enabled me to do some more interesting things than I
Yeah.
might have done otherwise.
Oh, I think changing format
Yeah.
makes a big difference, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
I think we all have a probably a comfort zone as far as size is concerned. Some people automatically think of something large the moment they look at a brief.
Mm.
Others automatically think of something tiny, and that's where their comfort zone lies.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's good to be pushed and it's good to try things. I think the other thing I like is to see how everybody will interpret, the title of an exhibition or a set brief that we might be given. It's always interesting to see, because what you take for granted as, well, of course this is about this, and somebody else will view in a completely different way. And that's always great.
Mm.
Yeah, I've really valued being in the group and what it's done for me. And I was on the committee for quite a long time, and I think that was very interesting, because you kind of get to know how things were run and how things were organised, and a bit about how the exhibitions were planned. So, yeah, I learnt a lot from the other members of the group as well.
Mm. Yeah, I'm sure, because everyone has a different style, a different approach, and sometimes you can really learn from that
Yeah.
and incorporate it into your own practice as you move forward.
Yeah, yeah, and also the professional practice side of things, just even knowing how to pack your work up to send it to an exhibition.
Mm.
Sometimes the really super practical things, you learn a lot. I used to wrap everything up in bubble wrap and seal it with masking tape. Masking tape's terrible. It's an awful thing to stick on bubble wrap because you can't peel it off. Those really practical things that you learn
Yeah,
from being involved. And, in the early days, I did quite a bit helping, well, I still have done actually fairly recently, helping hang exhibitions. And you learn from hanging other people's work so much. And you're like, oh, I see how they've made that, so that supports that, and you learn about how the nuts and bolts behind how different people present their work, which is fascinating.
yeah. I
Yeah,
hadn't thought about it like that, but yes, of course, you'll see all the hanging mechanisms and the way people pack, and yeah,
yeah,
that must be really interesting.
yeah, it's great. And they're the things that are very invisible when you're visiting an exhibition. Those are the things you shouldn't really notice.
No, you never see the back, do you? You never see the back. I believe that you've got a new book coming out shortly as well.
I have, yeah.
Can you
So
tell us anything about it, or?
I can, yeah, yeah. So the book is called Unfolding Cloth: Inspiration from Historical Textiles, and it's going to be published by Batsford. It's out in September 2025, and it's a book about, well, it's drawing a lot on my experiences. It's drawing a lot on, well, those dual aspects really of my teaching practice and my artistic practice, and looking a lot at how we might use historical textiles as a kind of starting point to research, to kind of give us ideas, to develop whole kind of projects from. And then also kind of looking, so there's kind of different aspects to the book, lots around research, lots around kind of developing ideas, and some things around making and presenting work as well. So it's a bit of a passion project, because it's kind of drawing on all the things that I love. And yeah, so it's been a real joy to put together.
So from because I know you have another book, don't you, as well, a previous book,
Yeah.
which is Poetic Cloth. Is that
Yeah,
that
that's
correct?
right. Yeah.
So you've obviously been through the process before,
Mhm.
um, and I wonder, is it something that Batsford's come to you and say that we want a book like this, or do you go to them and say, this is what I was thinking, would you like to publish it? How does it work?
Yeah, so actually on both occasions I've written a book proposal and sent it to them. So the first one was kind of a bit of the world well, one of my friends described it as the world according to Hannah Lamb, which I don't know how to take that one, but it's probably about right. And yeah, the second one was really, in some ways, the book that I wanted to write first, but perhaps wasn't quite ready originally. But yeah, Unfolding Cloth is kind of sort of just drawing on all of those passions that, as I said earlier, kind of really come from childhood, of the going to museums and, sketching things in museums, or looking through family albums or old boxes of buttons and tins of buttons. It's drawing on all those real formative kind of elements. So it was lovely to kind of put that into a proposal, and yeah, Batsford were really happy with it, loved it, and said, yeah, like that.
Yeah. And do you think you'll be doing more in the future?
Who knows? Who knows? I haven't actually got anything in mind at the moment, so it might be that it'll be a while before I do anything else.
Mm.
But yeah, I just really want to enjoy having this new book out, and I feel like there's a lot more. I mean, perhaps there's a sequel to that. I think there's a lot more around that theme that I would like to explore, and I'll continue exploring in my practice in the years to come,
Mm.
and in my teaching as well. I think, as I said, they kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and just the practicalities, because do you do your own photography for the book, or do you get a professional to do it?
So Batsford provide a photographer to shoot a lot of the content, but I actually already I have a fantastic photographer that I work with on a regular basis who does all of the shots of my work for kind of exhibitions and what have you. So I already had a really good bank of images. So there's a mixture in there of images by Michael, who's the photographer who does a lot of stuff for Batsford, and from my friend Lucy, who's shot some really superb images of my work, particularly kind of location things. So there's a lot of work that I've done that's been kind of in interesting settings, like interesting old mill buildings and what have you.
Mm.
And she's shot a lot of that stuff for me in the past. And we've kind of got a really great working relationship where she knows what I'm after, and we've got
Yeah.
great rapport. Yeah.
Because the photography is so important, isn't it, with textiles? Because textiles are notoriously quite difficult to photograph.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, she really gets it. She understands kind of how to capture the kind of three-dimensional qualities, the light. Light's so important in my work. She really understands the kind of transparency or translucency of materials, and just the aliveness of fabric. Sometimes I've very occasionally I've had work shot by other people, and they've just really until I see that I don't perhaps understand how a lot of people don't see fabric in the way that I see it, and and they kind of deaden it. It just looks really, I don't know what they do to it, but some people who are not very good at photographing textiles, it just looks so flat. I'm like,
Yeah.
what have they done to it? And I don't know whether it's the lighting or anyway. There's a magic to doing that, and uh, not everybody can do that, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think, the images on your site are wonderful as well. And do you do your own site, or is that something that you ask someone else to do for you? Because there's some absolutely glorious images on there.
Yeah, so again, those images are a lot of those are by Lucy. So yeah, she's superb. So she does majority of my photography of my work, but I put the website together. So yeah,
Mm.
they go together really well.
You need all sorts of skills, don't you, when you
Yeah.
or a designer maker in textiles. You need the obviously all of the textile skills and the design skills, but you also need the business skills, which can, depending on what people have been used to doing, can be a bit challenging.
Yeah, and admin skills, just general admin
Oh yeah.
skills. I think, and writing, I think a lot of people underestimate. I think if you're a visual artist that you're just making things or you're creating images all day and it's all creative, which isn't to say that some of those other things can't be creative, because they are. But, it's so essential to be able to write about your work. Any kind of application you do, whether it's for an exhibition or a commission or a residency, you've got to be able to write about your work. And, that's, I would say I spend probably far more time doing the other things that people don't really see
Mm,
than I do actually making. And that's sort of the reality of, I suppose,
yeah.
being a professional artist, is that you do have to do all that other stuff.
Yes, I agree with you. I think people have sometimes when I speak to people, they have quite a romanticised idea of
Absolutely.
what textile artists do. I think they think of you all day as sitting by a fire with a needle and thread in hand, and it just isn't like that, is it? Unfortunately.
No, no. It does all go hand in hand, and the way that you present your work is as important as the work itself. So whether that's in written applications or statements or whatever, or whether that's in terms of your website or an exhibition, how you present it is so important, because it's making sure that the story that you want to tell is what you're telling, and all of the elements kind of need to add up.
Yeah.
If you use a font that looks really out of place with your work, all of those things will jar. So you've got to make sure that everything ties up and is speaking the same language, whether that's visual language or written language. It's all got
Yeah,
to work together, hasn't it?
absolutely. Hannah, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me today. It's been an absolute
No problem
pleasure
at all. It's been great.
speaking with you.